Most people want the answer right now. So the better information we can have for you so you can manage your problem in a quick manner, the happier you're going to be and the better your crop's going to be overall. So looking at some basic insect characteristics, most of your adult insects have what we call a hard exoskeleton. So like we have our bones inside our body, their bones are on the outside of their body. They're kind of reversed the way they're designed. And so it's generally what we call a hard exoskeleton. And then there's some basic parts that each insect has, regardless of what type of insect. All insects are going to have a head. They're all going to have a thorax, which is the midsection where the wings are attached and the legs are also attached. And then you also have the abdomen, the stomach, if you will. And then all insects are going to have 3 pairs of legs. And then there is some variation with respect to wings. This is actually related to flies, and flies only have only have 1 pair of wings, but most other insects are going to have 2 pair of wings instead of 1. And then additionally, insects are what we call bilaterally symmetrical, meaning that we can cut them down the middle and you will have 2 equal halves. So if we took a knife and we cut this insect down like that, you've got 2 equal halves. Just like I'm bilaterally symmetrical. If you took a knife and you cut me down, you're going to have 2 equal halves, relatively speaking. And then, of course, all insects are going to have 1 pair of antennae as well. So the next thing I want to talk about, when we think about insects and we look at feeding damage, the mouth part, the type of mouth that the insect has is kind of dictates what the feeding damage looks like. And so often that's how we kind of decipher it. So earlier before we got started today, one gentleman brought me an eggplant leaf. And just looking at the leaf and looking at the type of feeding damage it had, it's pretty obvious to me that it's flea beetle damage. And so that's just stuff that you get used to over the course of time. And that only comes with more years of experience. As you do this more, you'll be more accustomed to it. But one of the problems, or one of the pests that we've dealt with in the past and still deal with, is spotted cucumber beetle. It has a chewing mouth part, similar to what we have. So it has mandibles, teeth, if you will, where it's actually chewing on the plant. Then we have an aphid. This is actually a microscopic image of an aphid, and I'll make it out here. But they have a needle-like mouth part. It's just like a spear, like a straw. It probes into the plant, sucks plant juice out into its mouth, and that's how it's feeding. And then you might not be able to make it out because it's fairly well camouflaged. That's one reason why they're so effective. Tomato hornworms also have chewing mouth parts. And they've got big chewing mouth parts, and they can take out a tomato plant. Exactly. They're very active feeders. Well, you're right. Because of their camouflage, they're very hard. I'll give you an example. We had just a small garden tomato in a pot for my son just to teach him things about gardening a few years ago. And I could see the feeding damage on it. And I knew pretty much that it was the hornworm. But man, it probably took 15, 20 minutes on a little plant to find that thing because it's so well camouflaged. So you gotta have your eyes open. You gotta be observant. You gotta be looking for things that don't look like so right or maybe look a little abnormal. But these guys will eat your lunch literally in a matter of minutes. They're really pretty fast. And then this is a stage where we really don't see a problem as far as the mouth part, but a moth or a butterfly, they have a siphoning-like mouth part, what we call proboscis, that kind of coils up, and they can uncoil it, and they're usually sticking it down into flowers, pulling out nectar and things of that nature. Moths usually aren't causing feeding problems, but the eggs they lay and they hatch, they can very well cause us problems. So there's 2 different types of morphing, if you will, metamorphosis with insects. One is a complete metamorphosis, basically where the young don't look anything like the adult stage. And so a complete metamorphosis, you might start out with an egg. You got the adult that lays the egg, and then it hatches, and you've got a caterpillar. And then it increases from the first instar to the second to the third, and each consecutive instar is just getting bigger and bigger. But will everybody agree that this immature stage looks nothing like the adult butterfly? And so that's what we would call complete metamorphosis. So for simple or incomplete metamorphosis, the nymph or the immature stage essentially looks just like the adult. There's a few little differences, and the nymphs usually won't have their wings developed at that point. They'll have what we call wing buds, so just the early starting of wings. But in this case, with this grasshopper, a nymph After it's hatched in the small stage, going up and molting into the next stage, it's essentially the same. It just doesn't have its wings yet. Coloration may be a little different, but physically, structurally, it's about the same as the adult. Here's one of the problems which I've encountered, and actually 2 years ago, it took out an entire cantaloupe in one day. And part of that can be managed with planting data. But this is seed corn maggot. And basically what they do is the eggs will get laid at the base of the plant, the egg will hatch, excuse me, then the maggot will start feeding on some of the roots and burrow up into the stalk of the plant and cause collapse of the plant. Squash bugs are another problem, which I'm sure some of you that have grown cucurbits may have encountered. These are immature stages that are growing and developing, and usually have egg clusters. There are different management tactics, but again, we mentioned thresholds. You're also looking at, are there any good insects out there that are providing any benefit for me? Maybe I don't need to spray. Because oftentimes a pesticide you may spray would not only affect the pest insect, but also the beneficial insect. So that's why scouting is very important. Knowing what's in your planting is very important. So in early season, if we have squash bug action thresholds, if we see wilting in the field and several squash bugs present, then we need to do something during the early flowering stage. If you have an average of more than one egg mass per plant. So that's why, again, you should be checking on a weekly basis at minimum. You should be going through your crop and looking for problems. Spider mites. Anybody experience spider mites? And they're probably in their ornamental garden. Spider mites feed on just about anything. They feed on trees. They feed on ornamental plants. They feed on shrubs. They feed on fruits and vegetables. That really can cause serious problems. So oftentimes with the spider mite, now this is not an insect. This is an arachnid. So it's got 4 pair of legs, like a true spider would. But they have mouth parts like an aphid, meaning that it's like a little needle. So what they're doing is they're sucking the juice out of the plant. And so oftentimes, if you look on the top side of the leaf, you see little white specks. And that's where they've actually sucked the juice out at individual spots. And so that's something else I haven't mentioned yet is, where are these insects located on the plant? Now, usually with a spider mite, they're going to be on the underside of the leaf. And so you can't just walk through and look at your plants at this height and just expect you'll see it. You need to get down, you need to flip that leaf over, look on the underside of the leaf, and you need to look at different parts of the plant. Look at the top part of the plant, look at the middle part of the plant, and look at the older leaf tissue as the plant matures. Because different pests like to hang out in different environments. Some prefer to hang out at the top of the plant, some like it shadier, a little bit cooler, and they hang out in the lower portion of the plant. Scouting is really big for spider mites. You can really get out of hand in a hurry. Again, whether you're conventional or organic, you've really got to stay on top of these. If you see webbing all over the top of your leaves, you are too late. You are too late. European corn borer, not in corn, but actually in a pepper stem, using scouting and then possibly using pheromone traps, which if you're not familiar with the pheromone trap, basically in a laboratory you can make this pheromone, which is a chemical that's given off by the male or the female insect. And so you put this bait, if you will, in a trap, and that gives you some indication of when these insects are flying or when they're present, because otherwise you don't know when they're there. Unless you're doing thorough scouting to be able to make a decision of when you want to make a pest application. This is the same thing we talked about before with insect thresholds. We've got corn earworm moths, and so when we're finding and identifying these moths, what you see here, this is actually the corn silks, and she's laying eggs on those corn silks that will hatch, and they'll crawl down into the top of that egg. Has anybody ever bought an ear corn? You get the worm at the top of it?
Oh, it's
Really exposed to it.
Well, it's extra protein the way I look at it, right? But anyways, but so they're just crawling in the top. And with a pest like corn earworm, timing is everything. Because if that egg is hatched and that larva has crawled down in that top of that, you can't get insecticide in there. You can't, unless you physically tear it open and pull the worm out, you're not going to do anything about it. And at that point, you kind of defeat the purpose. And so this is, I mentioned pheromone trap earlier. This is a type of, and this is actually a cage trap that we use for corn earworm. And this is the same type of traps we use in this state or any other state for monitoring corn earworm. Something else which is helpful, I talked about scouting a little bit, but you can't be in your field or in your garden 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Well, there's what we have called sticky cards. And so you just get a small stake and you can attach these sticky cards to them. And they come in typically in yellow or blue. And I like to use both, some of both, because blue and yellow attract different insects. And it's just a sticky substance. It's just kind of like those sticky traps for rats and for mice, except it's collecting insects. They attract you to it, they land on it. And then that way we can see what insects you're having. Now this doesn't work for all insects. It's only going to work for flying insects. You're not going to find caterpillars stuck to that usually. You're not going to find two-spotted spider mites stuck to that. But for some of your larger flying insects, it can be very effective. Let's talk a little bit about biological control. You can be very successful with biological control if you understand the system very well. In 4 years, the last 4 years I spent in Florida working in a greenhouse, I made one insecticide application in 4 years. And in Florida, we have just about every insect and disease you could ever imagine. But so how did we do it? We used biological control. And the only reason I made that pesticide application that season is because I took over somebody else's crop that year that had already let it get infested with spider mites. It was too far gone. But biological control can work very well. So I'll give you some examples. Broad mite is another type of mite which likes to feed on peppers. And it likes to be at the very top of the plant usually, but it will also feed on the fruit itself. So this is a nice marketable bell pepper fruit. This is one that's been damaged from feeding by a broad mite. And broad mites are very, very small. So you've got a mobile nymph, you've got an adult female here, and you have an adult male carrying a female nymph. They're very, very small. And they're even difficult to see with a hand lens. So there are some options for biological control for these types of mites and other mites. But one thing I want to point out is white flies are another pest which we can encounter in the state of Kentucky and certainly in other states in the southeast, which causes feeding damage, can also transmit virus. But if you look really, really close, look at the legs. There, 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 and there. Those are broad mites hitchhiking on the white fly. Insects that are hitchhiking. The broad mites, when the white fly landed on the pepper plant and had broad mites on it, they crawled onto the legs of the white fly. And the white fly flew to another plant, and the white fly is effectively spreading broad mites as well. So the white fly is a problem, but it's also spreading broad mites, which is a problem too. It's just interesting to see, we don't think a lot about insects. We don't necessarily give them a lot of credit for their intelligence. But you can't tell me that's not pretty highly intelligent to be able to learn to hitchhike off of another insect and get transported from one to the next. Because they don't grow wings, they don't have wings. So this is another type of mite, but this is a predatory mite. It's called Neoselius californicus. It eats other mites. So this is a good guy. And so you can buy these in a bottle of 1,000. They work quite well. But the point I want to make to you guys is with biological control, you can't go halfway through the season and all of a sudden see a major problem and say, well, I'm going to go buy some good insects and I'm going to release them and solve the issue. They don't work that fast. It's not like an insecticide. You need to start with this type of stuff from the very beginning. And so when I was transplanting peppers into a greenhouse in Florida, after I got done transplanting, I was going around with this little bottle, sprinkling on predatory mites. So they have a population there that's already building up. And so if you don't have a good idea, this is basically like a small spice bottle, small plastic spice bottle, and the mites are sent with bran, pieces of bran. And the reason they send them with bran is because it gives them hiding places. Because if they can't hide from one another, they'll eat one another. Because they are cannibalistic as well. So they've got to have some food source. But so you sprinkle it, and you'll see the bran more so than you will the mites. And the other interesting thing is there are naturally occurring predatory mite species. And if I can give you one bit of advice, you say, well, how can I know if it's a good mite or if it's a bad mite? Generally speaking, mites that feed on plants, they move very slow. Let's say that I'm a mite right now. Well, I'm standing on this floor, but let's say it's a leaf. How far do I have to go to find my food? I'm standing on it. It's right there. But if I'm a predatory mite seeking out other mites on a leaf, I got to move actively. and you can see them moving very rapidly on the underside of the leaf, as opposed to a very slow movement by plant feeding mites typically. So remember what I said about if you get webbing all over the plant, it's too late? There's an example of too late. And you start to see some yellowing, but all the feeding is on the bottom side of the leaf. And so that's why you've got to be flipping these leaves over. And so here, Tetranicus urticae is the scientific name for two-spotted spider mite. Here's an egg for it, a little bit darker, amber colored, and more round. Where you've got Neocoelus californicus, the predatory mite I just showed you. That's an egg. It's a little bit more clear, a little bit more elongated as opposed to round. But you're going to need hand lenses to see stuff like that. But you can get some fairly inexpensively. So I really like some of these images because it shows what the predator can really do to the bad guys. And so you've got a two-spotted spider mite here. Here's the predatory mite sticking its mouth part into the posterior end and basically going to suck the contents out of the two-spotted spider mite. Here, you've got a different species of predatory mite, the red one here. But this one on the left is a two-spotted spider mite. Phytocelius persillus is climbing on the back, getting ready to start piercing into that two-spotted spider mite, sucking out the contents, and killing the two-spotted spider mite. Well, actually, one other picture. This just shows you the relative size, and look at how their legs are held, things of that nature kind of help you differentiate between the species. Let's talk about aphids for a moment. Aphids, cotton aphid, melon aphid, they can cause a lot of feeding problems. They can also transmit virus. But we have what's called Aphidius columani. It's a wasp, but it's a very, very tiny wasp. And what it does is it will lay eggs. It will lay on an aphid, and it will lay an egg inside the aphid. Then we call this a mummy aphid. And so it's not dead, but it's not actively feeding. And so the egg that's been laid by the parasitoid wasp is growing inside, developing, and then will chew its way out the posterior end of the aphid and fly out, and then continue building the population up over time. We haven't mentioned thrips yet, but thrips are another insect species. Western flower thrips are probably the most common we see. They can also transmit virus. If you see these rings here, that's tomato spotted wilt virus on pepper. But there are some beneficials. Typically, thrips like to hang out in flowers. So one way of scouting for thrips is to take some of your flowers over a white sheet of paper and gently bang those flowers from their vegetable crop on that white sheet of paper. And you can usually see the thrips on there. That will give you some indication of their presence or not. And so one of the beneficial insects we can use is called Aureus, an Aureus species. We also call it mining pirate bug. You see here on this leaf, this flower petal, and it will go around. It's much larger, but it will feed on individual thrips. But we also have a type of predatory mite, which will also feed on thrips. So there's a lot of good insects available out there which you can utilize. You just need to have the understanding of how to implement them. I want to talk a little bit about pesticide safety, and this goes regardless of the type, whether it's organically improved, whether it's conventional. You're still dealing with the product which is intended to cause some harm to a particular type of organism. Some of the things that you encounter, though, typically is what we call REI. You can see that on labels. REI stands for re-entry interval. So if I made a pesticide application at 7 o'clock tonight, and the re-entry interval was 12 hours, that means I cannot, or nobody can go back in that field until 7 a.m. the next morning, unless they're wearing the proper PPE, which is what you have to wear while applying. PPE stands for personal protective equipment. It can vary based on what product you're using. It could be something as simple as long sleeves and gloves. It could be eye protection. It could be a full suit and respirator. I've been at all levels of that. I've used some. It just depends on what type of product you're using. But the label is the law. You should always wear your PPE. And for me, even if it doesn't say use something for your eye protection, just the nature of spraying and getting small particles, I always wear eye protection, mixing or making an application. Sunglasses are sufficient, or if you wanted to wear just clear safety glasses, you can wear those as well. The other abbreviation I want to bring your attention to is PHI, which stands for pre-harvest interval. So it means a minimum amount of time that has to pass from pesticide application to harvest. So if the pre-harvest interval is say 12 hours or 24 hours, you can harvest it and consume it 12 or 24 hours after the application time. But some products will have a very long pre-harvest interval, like 35 days. But that's usually a product you would use at planting. So you've got 35 days usually, depending on the crop, of course. Now lettuce, you may not have enough time, but something like a tomato or watermelon or cantaloupe, you're going to have plenty of time to get to that stage. And so these are just some labels here. And it's usually hard to find. You really got to dig through some of these labels. But here on this particular one it says restricted entry interval of 48 hours for all crops. So you got to wait 2 days from the time of application before you can re-enter that field unless you're wearing your PPE. Here we talk about personal protective equipment. In this case, it's talking about coveralls over long sleeve shirt and long pants, chemical resistant gloves, chemical resistant footwear plus socks, goggles, or face shield. I mean, it continues to go on, and that's going to vary based on what product you're applying. You also look at some of the words on the front page of that label. So poison, that's going to be a more toxic product as opposed to something that might just have caution on it. And then here's examples where we have pre-entry or re-entry interval of, pre-harvest interval of 7 days on this instance. And then there's a few basic things for organic pest management, some of the things that, and the reality of it is a lot of this stuff I incorporated into conventional systems too. I really don't like to separate the two because the reality of it when it comes down to the end of the day, it's really hard for things just to be black and white. There's usually a lot of gray area. And so one thing I like to do is, whatever I try to do, try to make it sustainable. An article I read recently interviewing a farmer in the southeastern U.S., they said, are you a conventional farmer or are you an organic farmer? And his answer was, some of the practices I use you would consider organic, some you would consider conventional. But I can assure you whatever it is I do, it's sustainable. And just keep that in mind. So if you really are interested in using organic products, this is a website or something you really need to be able to gain access to. It's called OMRI, which is the Organic Materials Review Institute. This is where you will find the lists of products which are what we would call OMRI approved, which means they would fit under the protocol for certified organic production systems. So then you want to look for pesticides, fertilizer materials to make sure that they are what we call OMRI approved if you are in fact doing a certified organic